In this episode of the Busy Mind podcast, you'll learn some simple, actionable steps that you can take to start recovering from chronic stress and burnout as soon as today. These are what I call the essential self-care practices, things that must be in place, and we could even call them critical self-care practices or strategies. There's 7 of them, and they're the types of self-care that make a real lasting difference. And we'll talk all about that, all about what each one of them are, how to get started, and also how focusing on these could help you get more out of any of the other self-care practices that you might be doing. Welcome to the Busy Mind podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Wheeler, former public school teacher and professional development trainer of mindfulness and emotional intelligence, turned coach and course creator of mindfulness-based stress and burnout relief. But it wasn't all that long ago that I was deep in a state of overwhelm, chronic stress, and totally burnt out. Fast forward past so much suffering and lessons learned to the mostly calm, resilient, joyful state of being I have today. One that used to only exist as a wish and a daydream, and one where I get to share the priceless insights from my rewarding journey of healing and growth, knowing I've helped countless others break free from their own suffering to find their own place of peace, regain control, and take their life to the next level. I created the Busy Mind podcast to give you simple, actionable, step-by-step strategies to help you on your own personal journey from stress to strength. So if you're looking for relief from overwhelm, stress, or burnout, or on a journey of healing and growth, or want to maximize your potential in a sustainable way, you're in the right place, and I'm so glad you're here. In this episode of the Busy Mind podcast, you'll hear about simple, actionable steps you can take to start recovering from chronic stress and burnout on a deep physiological level. So things that are really going to make a difference over time. The 2 main first steps to take when recovering from chronic stress and burnout are first, completing the stress response cycle regularly. And we'll talk about what I mean by that if you're not familiar with that. And then second, next up, is to focus on what I call the essential self-care practices or essential self-care strategies. There's 7 of them. We'll talk all about them and also how these are different from what I call hashtag self-care practices, things that might be helpful but aren't really going to help you on a deep biological, physiological level over time and really create space for the healing that needs to happen. And you'll have an opportunity to identify which one is your top need so that you have a clear, simple place to start and so that you don't get overwhelmed by all 7 of them. You don't need to deal with all 7 of them, and we'll talk all about that. And then I'll share some personal examples and stories of how I focused on these. And one last thing before we get to the good stuff. Please keep in mind that this podcast is intended for informational and educational purposes. It's not intended to substitute for professional medical advice or diagnosis or treatment, so make sure to consult with your medical professional before making changes to things like your diet, your exercise routine, your medical regimen, your lifestyle, or your mental health care. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a clinician. I am here as a teacher, a coach, an advisor, and as a friend. Okay, so let's start by addressing the term self-care. So what I call hashtag self-care are things like taking an afternoon off to get a massage, or taking a hot bath, going and getting a mani-pedi, or even having coffee with a friend, or having a glass of wine after a long day. And it's funny, the DJs on my morning radio show were talking about this just on the same morning that I was writing the notes for this episode. So it was just interesting and really timely to hear them talking about this exact thing and how important self-care is and how helpful self-care can be. And they were talking about these exact things that I kind of call hashtag self-care. Things that are good but aren't really going to move the needle very much in the long term. And so these things can be helpful, great ways to relax and even to find some joy. But again, they're not the kinds of things that are really going to make a lasting difference overall, especially for addressing overwhelm, chronic stress, and burnout. They just relieve some of the symptoms temporarily here and there, and they're not usually used in like any kind of systemic way. So what we're going to focus on today are some other practices that I call essential self-care practices that are very basic and important behaviors that we actually need to take on a regular basis in order to start to feel some noticeable, lasting relief. And they're things that support your nervous system and your biology and your physiology on a deeper level when done strategically. And they're things that are inarguable. You just can't argue these things. They're accepted by experts from different walks of life, medical practitioners, as well as holistic or integrated health practitioners. They make sense. They're backed by science and research. And so that's what we're going to talk about. And so again, when they're done intentionally, regularly, strategically, they make an impact over time. So I'm going to get to them in just a minute. Building up the suspense, what are those 7 self-care practices? But first, there's 2 main things that you need to do. So step 1 is completing the stress response cycle daily. And I'll talk more about that if you're not familiar with what that is and how to get more familiar with what that is. And then our main focus is going to be on step 2, those essential self-care practices. Okay, so for step 1, completing the stress response cycle daily, I recommend that you go check out episode 2 of this podcast, the Busy Mind podcast. It's called The Fastest Way to Recover from Chronic Stress and Burnout. So if you can, I say press pause and go check it out. Listening to that will help you get so much more out of today's episode. And I put a link to the episode in the show notes. You can also find it at melissamwheeler.com/2. And in that episode, you'll hear about what I share as the difference between overwhelm versus chronic stress versus burnout. You'll also hear about how the nervous system and the stress response works, how it works when it's working as it's designed, and then also what's happening with it when things go haywire, when there's problems, and then why that happens. You'll also hear about why you might not be feeling so good and the clear link between chronic stress and poor health. And how it's not in your head. Sometimes you might be thinking that some of these things are all in your head. Not feeling good mentally, not feeling good emotionally, not feeling good physically. But there's real medical, physiological things that are going on when we have really high levels of stress over time. I'll also share in that episode what it means to complete your stress response cycle regularly, why you need to complete it regularly, exactly how to do that, and how it will help so very much. You'll hear about how completing the stress response cycle helps your body move from fight or flight or freeze to rest and digest, and how that helps get you to a place where you can now think clearly and start feeling at least a little bit better. So that now you have the bandwidth to get started with step 2, the most essential self-care practices that we're going to talk about today. Sometimes when we're in these really deep states of chronic stress and burnout and overwhelm, it just feels so overwhelming to even think about implementing more things. But if you can complete your stress response cycle regularly, it'll start help you to feel better pretty quickly and pretty soon, so that now you have more of a bandwidth to do the things that are really going to help you and really make a difference over time. So go check it out. And then lastly, you'll hear about barriers and challenges that you'll come up against when working on these strategies and how to overcome them. So it's great if you can go check it out. But if you just totally can't do that, that's all good. Today's episode works fine as a standalone, but really, if I could go back and rename the episode, I would call that a part 1, and I would call today a part 2. But either way, you're here now, and so we're going to get into these essential self-care practices. And so completing the stress response cycle regularly and daily, and these essential self-care practices, these are the exact things that you need to do to feel better as fast as possible. And there's several that you can start today or tomorrow and start to notice a difference. How soon you start to notice the difference depends on your exact situation, but they will start to work over time. And when you're not doing these things, your nervous system really is functioning at a deficit, and you either won't be able to recover or it'll be much harder and take so much more time. So this is how you really do start to heal. Okay, so here they are. these 7 essential self-care practices: quality sleep, balanced nutrition, physical activity, supportive relationships, experiencing nature, mental health and mental health care, and mindfulness and meditation practices. So those are the 7. And they're not in any particular order, but I did put sleep at the top because sleep has become pretty much or lack of sleep, not getting enough sleep and enough quality sleep has pretty much become an epidemic. Almost everyone I know isn't getting enough sleep, either because they don't get enough hours in bed or asleep, or because they have trouble sleeping while in bed, trouble falling asleep, or waking up a lot, or waking up too early and too soon. And I like to place mindfulness and meditation at the bottom of the list because they have the potential to support us with all of the other practices. And how can that be? That's because when you want to make a change in any area, you first need to become 100% conscious of all of the thoughts, feelings, and actions you're having or taking relating to that change. And when we practice meditation and when we have mindful awareness, it helps us increase our levels of consciousness and awareness. That consciousness and that awareness that we need to make those other changes that we want to be making. So if, a couple of these or several of these are speaking to you, then maybe mindfulness and meditation is a great place to start. And as a meditation teacher, of course, I'm a huge fan of this one. And we'll talk a little bit more about all of that as we go along here. But I wanted to share about the benefits, the huge impactful benefits that go with each of these practices and with all of these practices. So these things, when we do them regularly, they help balance our stress hormones. So cortisol and adrenaline, really, really powerful hormones and chemicals in our bodies. They support brain health, so things like cognition, being able to think clearly, and so much more. They support heart health, so our cardiovascular system. These things help prevent heart disease, which is one of the leading causes of preventable death. And these things help strengthen our immune system. So they help prevent sickness and illness. They help us recover faster from injury and illness. So really, really huge benefits from making sure that we're practicing these essential self-care strategies. And then I want to mention too that 2 of these overlap with the strategies for completing your stress response cycle regularly. And those 2 are physical activity and mindfulness or meditation practice. So if you were to focus on one of those, it will support you in the essential self-care practices and completing the stress response cycle. All right, so we've got the 7, but I want to say too that you do not have to do them all. You don't have to do them all today. And actually, I would say, please don't. Please don't try to focus on all 7 of them or even on multiple ones. My recommendation for your next step in starting to work with these is to determine which one needs your attention most. So if you were to put them in priority order, which one would be your first priority? How would you rank them? Which one would you put first? Which one second? And which one third? And I'll repeat them one more time just in case it helps. So there's sleep, nutrition, physical activity, relationships, nature, mental health, and mindfulness and meditation. So which one needs your attention most? And I would say start there. That's the best place to start, just focusing on that one. And then once you feel like you have a pretty good handle on that one and you're starting to feel some of those benefits from working on that one, and then if you want to, then come back and look at the list again and start working on that second one. And then if you want a handout or a worksheet to support you with all of this, I created a PDF. So it's a free downloadable PDF that has a checklist of each of these along with some journal prompts. And the journal prompts will help you get clarity on what you want to do and what you need to do and help you get momentum and figure out what are the next tiniest, smallest steps that you can start today or tomorrow to start making progress on these. And so I'd love to share it with you. You can find it at melissamwheeler.com/essential, and I'll put a link in the show notes. And if you're curious where this list comes from, I'll share about that, and then we'll talk a little bit more in detail about each one of these. So this list comes from Dr. Nadine Burke Harris. She is a physician, a medical doctor, and she was the first Surgeon General here in California. She's also an author and a researcher and so much more. And she talks about these practices in her book. It's called The Deepest Well, and she refers to them sort of as a toolkit for dealing with stress. And then there's something called the ACEs Aware Initiative. It's a state program here in California, and they share just so much more in depth about each of these practices. And if you wanted to check them out, they're at acesaware.org, and I'll link to that in the show notes as well. And if you were to dive into these resources, you would learn all about why these essential self-care practices are so critical. And you would learn about how the adversity, trauma, and stress that you've experienced, especially if you experienced it in childhood, has made you more susceptible to chronic stress and burnout, and how it's made your system more sensitive. I have found it extremely helpful and just so fascinating, and learning about all of this has helped me understand my situation and why I am the way I am. And I've been sharing this with people over the years, hundreds of people, maybe even thousands of people at this point. And it's just been so great to see so many light bulbs on and just this deep understanding of what exactly is going on for folks, especially if we're experiencing chronic stress and getting into states of burnout. And so my plan is to talk about exactly this in the next episode. So make sure to check out the next episode for more on that. All right, so let's talk just a little bit more about each one. Let's talk about exactly what it is and exactly what you need to do. And then in future episodes, I'd love to go more in depth about exactly how to do these practices and share more tips and strategies, where to start, and resources for really digging into these, and really whichever one is your biggest area of focus. And I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to know, which one do you want to hear about the most? And the ones that I hear the most feedback about, I'd love to do another episode or two focused on specific essential self-care practices. So let me know. Send me a direct message, leave a review, send me a message, send me some feedback. I really want to know, and I'd love to do a future episode on the one that you need support with the most. Okay, so quality sleep. How many hours a night of sleep do we need? Any guesses? Do you know how many? How many are you getting each night on average? The amount of hours per night that we need, that adults need, is 7 to 9 hours each night. Teenagers need 8 to 10, and smaller children, it's a different amount. But it's a medical fact. There's very few anomalies. We need 7 to 9 hours per night. And I know that not getting enough sleep is so common. I mentioned before, it's pretty much an epidemic, especially when we consider, too, that this one is about quality sleep, not just the quantity, the 7 to 9 hours of sleep, but the quality. And so few people, so few of us are getting quality sleep, too. But let's first just by talking about quantity, the number of hours. So it's just so common to not get enough sleep. And I see people kind of wearing it as like a badge of honor, like, oh, I can get by on 5 or 6 and I just have an extra 2 or 3 cups of coffee and I'm good to go. So that doesn't work. That's not going to help your nervous system heal. You really do need those 7 to 9 hours per night. And then there's that range, but it's also important to note that needs are different per person. So how do you figure that out? You might just have an idea of how much sleep you need personally. One way to tell is to see how much you naturally sleep when you're fully rested, or maybe when you're on vacation or after coming back from a vacation, if that is something that you've experienced. And I realized that you might have never felt that way, fully rested. So This might seem unrealistic. I get that. But if that's the case, you can always start with getting at least 7 hours and then go from there. Sometimes, too, we think that just getting 5 or 6 during the week and then catching up on weekends will work, but that doesn't work either, not for long-term health. It's all about consistency and getting that 7 to 9 hours, however much it is for you, on a regular basis. And I know this one can be so tough. This has been a really big area of focus and challenge and struggle for me over the years. I used to only get 5 or 6 hours, and I used to think, tell myself stories about how it was okay, but it really started taking its toll. And I'm so happy and proud and excited to share that now I get on average between 7.5 and 8.5. I personally need 7.5 to 8, just depending on what's going on. And my average currently right now, the last couple of months, is 7.5. And before that, it was 8. I'm getting up a little bit earlier these days, so I'm right at about 7.5. So I've increased my quantity of sleep over time, and I've been working really closely lately on improving the quality of sleep. It took a lot to get here. What helped me in the beginning, years and years ago, what helped me make my first big jump was participating in something called the Whole Life Challenge, which is an online health and wellness game. So it's gamification of health and wellness. If you want to check it out, I'll drop a link in the show notes. And a coworker of mine invited me to join, and I wasn't really that interested, but I was interested in just the community and the fun that I might have. So I went ahead and joined after she invited me several times. I finally gave in and gave it a try. And it was really, really helpful. And I think the biggest help was so each day you log in and you track and you note how you did in each of these wellness areas. One of them was sleep. So it's kind of like a habit tracker with a scoring system. And so I hadn't used habit trackers before or anything like that, but I found that over time, as I logged in and as I experienced and saw my progress little by little and bit by bit, it just became really, really motivating. It gave me just this huge sense of progress and accomplishment. And I had no idea the excitement and the momentum that it would build for me. And then I just took off from there. So just an example of one thing that helped me get and improve on the number of hours. And then I've been doing a lot of things to help with the quality over time that have really helped. And those are something I'd love to maybe talk about in a future episode. So let me know if sleep is something that you'd like to hear more about. Just so many strategies and things that you can do to increase the number of hours and the quality. All right, balanced nutrition. So anytime we talk about nutrition, it can be such a loaded topic. There's so many considerations, cultural and ethical considerations. People have dietary needs and dietary restrictions. So just to acknowledge that, but also no matter what nutrition plan or eating program or diet we look at, most, if not all, would agree that eating a variety of nutritious foods is what we need to focus on if we want to have balanced nutrition and be healthy with our food choices. So what does that mean? It means eating whole foods, foods that come from nature, foods that haven't been changed, foods that haven't been processed too much from their original form. So foods that look like they did when they were in nature. So it's going to be things like vegetables like leafy greens, fruit like apples and berries, nuts, seeds, lentils, beans, healthy fats like olive oil, lean protein like fish, whole grains like quinoa, brown rice, black rice, these kinds of foods. These kinds of foods are nutrient dense, which means that they're high in vitamins, minerals, healthy fats, healthy proteins, and healthy carbohydrates. And if you wanted to have a specific nutrition plan or dietary program to help guide you, you could look into and search about the anti-inflammatory diet, and the Mediterranean diet is another one that does really well here. And if all of this is just too overwhelming, If eating this healthy with all of these types of nutrient-dense foods just seems too far out of reach, then just start where you are. As with all of these, just start where you are and figure out what your first next step is. So maybe it's starting by adding in 1 serving of vegetables a day, or adding in 2 servings of nutrient-dense foods a day, or 1 at each meal. Just starting where you are, finding something that's doable and actionable and accessible for where you are now. All right, and then there's physical activity. So adults need 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity aerobic activity. And so if you were to break that up, maybe 5 days a week, it would be 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week, moderate intensity aerobic activity. And so that's things like walking. It could be as simple as walking, or faster dancing, and also weightlifting. And there's a variety of things that you could do for this one. And if that just seems so far out of reach and too overwhelming, start where you are. Once again, just start where you are. Maybe you start out with 30 minutes 2 days a week, or 30 minutes 3 days a week. And if even that seems just too much, start with 10 minutes. 10 minutes a day, 1 or 2 days a week. Start where you are and then build each week. Be kind to yourself. This one can be so hard. They all can be hard and difficult and challenging. Change is hard, but it can be really hard to find the extra time to exercise. But you can do it. Make a plan, set goals, download the worksheet that I mentioned, go through those journal prompts, and it'll help you figure out exactly how to get started from exactly where you are personally. And then it's helpful to note there's some extra benefits for physical activity. So in addition to the benefits that I mentioned for all of these self-care practices, physical activity and exercise actually gives us more energy. So it can be counterintuitive, right? Because it takes all this extra energy to get started being physically active, but it makes our systems more efficient, and that gives us more energy. It also produces endorphins, which are natural feel-good chemicals in the body that just make us feel good. They make us feel better mentally and emotionally. And physical activity also helps to calm the brain and the body in the midst of stress. And that's one of the reasons why it's an activity and a strategy that helps us complete our stress response cycle. And then there's supportive relationships. So this one is about having connections that feel safe and that are stable, caring, nurturing, loving, and healthy. It can be with family and friends, or teachers, coaches, mentors, really anyone who helps us feel better when we lean on them. But it's just the importance of having that at least one person to really lean on that we know is there for support and that we know is there when we're going through difficult and dark times. And it can just be as simple as someone to talk to. It can also be just getting out into social activities, saying yes to those invites that you might not feel up for doing, but doing it because you know you need this in your life. You know that you need those supportive relationships. And it could be focusing on deepening relationships that are already in existence, or maybe you need to make some new connections. And that can be as simple as paying attention to what's going on locally. So there's often events and offerings in your local community offered through places like libraries. You can check your community center, parks and rec programs, and also volunteering opportunities. Great places to make connections and start developing supportive relationships. And there's extra benefits with this one too. Supportive relationships help us live longer. It's so important and so helpful for longevity. Experiencing nature, the 5th essential self-care practice. So this is all about spending time outdoors, basically just getting outside, getting out for walks. It could be short walk breaks. It could be choosing trees over television. And you could do this with friends and family to make it more fun. It might be visiting the little local parks that you have available to you in your neighborhood or community, or even if you have to drive a little ways, it's totally worth it. It might be finding playgrounds or seeing what community gardens are out there. And when you are taking this time in nature, taking time to experience nature, taking time to really slow down and pause, see if you can engage the senses. See which of your senses you can engage. So it might be seeing what in nature piques your sense of sight, or what in nature piques your sense of sound. So it might be a beautiful tree, or some leaves rustling in the wind, or a bird chirping. So just seeing if you can pay attention to your senses. And if you're doing something like just taking a walk around the block, you might see a bunch of things that aren't nature. You might see cement and sidewalk and street and cars and buildings and these kinds of things. But it's all about noticing what is actually there in nature. Maybe there's a tree. Maybe there's a bush with some leaves or some flowers. What can you find in nature to focus on? And you can find offerings and opportunities for this, again, through your local park and recreation programs, local community centers. You can check out things at the county level, look at family centers. Often they're offering outdoor activities. And this one has extra added benefits. It supports relationships. It helps us feel happy, and it increases life satisfaction, just spending a little time in nature. And then I'm realizing just now, too, that this is another 2-for-1. So time in nature, experiencing nature, is an essential self-care practice and is also a strategy to help us complete our stress response cycle. Mental health and mental health care. So let's take a look at this one if this is one that you chose as your area of focus. So this is all about taking care of your thoughts and feelings. And it's really noticing when challenging feelings and states have gotten to be too much and they're just taking over. Feeling sad, anxious, isolated, alone, angry, or stressed. Or it could be things on a deeper level like depression, substance use, substance abuse, thoughts of suicide. All fall into this area of mental health and mental health care. And we're going to talk about each one of these separately, mental health and mental health care. But I first want to acknowledge that there's often a stigma around mental health and when we talk about mental health. So I just want to name it and I just want to acknowledge it and say that there doesn't need to be a stigma. There's nothing wrong with taking care of our mental health. We take care of our physical health and there's no stigma around that. So taking care of our mental health, I feel, should be just as normalized. All right, so for general mental health, there's things that you can do when you just need some mild daily support and that you can use your own resources for. And so it can be when really simple things like taking a pause and doing some breathing can help, or practicing some gratitude, or taking some time out for some fun or some joy, or making sure that we have a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose and passion in our lives. And I've heard of this one called emotional fitness as well. And I just love this idea. And it's the idea of having the ability to move from challenging emotions to helpful emotions and not getting stuck in the place of challenging emotions, and the ability to move from places of sadness and anxiety and feeling alone to more helpful states like happiness and joy and awe, gratitude, compassion, and love. And so it might be just reflecting on what do you need to do to experience these more helpful states? Because if there's not any joy, if there's not any fun, if there's not any meaning in life, what is the point of it all anyway? And practicing the other essential self-care practices can be really, really helpful and supportive for this one as well. So another kind of 2-for-1 area. And then there's the mental health care part of this. So this is when we need extra support and we need to look to outside resources. We're not able to get our mental health care needs met just on our own. So if you're having any significant challenges here, you can look into counseling or therapy for mental health or for behavioral health or for substance use. You can also look into finding a psychiatrist if there's a situation where you need medication or specialty care. And then I want to throw in some ideas for specifically where to start for this one, since this one can be more serious, especially when suicide falls into this category. So, where to start? A great place to start can be to check with your doctor or your medical provider and ask for a referral. You can also check with your behavioral health resources through health insurance if you have that. There's also something called the EAP programs or employee assistance programs through employers. Those are great programs that are offered at no extra cost through some employers. You could also look at Psychology Today, their website, to find a therapist. They have an online directory that has different therapists organized by location close to where you are, has the therapist and a photo and a description of what they do and who they help. And then lastly, I want to share, if you are in crisis, if you're in immediate crisis, then you can always text 988 if you need help. That's for the 988 Suicide Prevention and Mental Health Crisis Lifeline. And if you are in crisis, whether you're considering suicide or not, if you are in crisis, please know that you're not alone. You're not alone. There are other people who feel this way, and there are other people who have felt this way and who have overcome. There is hope. Do not give up. There are people who care that are here to help. Text 988 and you'll be connected with people and services here to help you. All right, and on to our 7th and final essential self-care practice, mindfulness and mindfulness meditation practices. So, mindfulness, what is it? Also known as awareness or consciousness, and if we were to look at a textbook definition, it would be paying attention to the present moment on purpose and without judgment, as opposed to or instead of focusing on or worrying about the past or the future, which is often where our minds just generally go, thinking about the past or worrying about the future. So it's just being in the present moment, in this current moment, what's happening now. And it's also being aware of internal thoughts and feelings and responses. And it's the ability to recognize your stress response and then to respond thoughtfully to stressors instead of reacting impulsively and reacting maybe in ways that you wouldn't want to if you had more awareness. It's also focus, concentration, and attention, the ability to hold your focus, to concentrate, and to pay attention. And then I wanted to share a special note about this one. So this is the number one most important thing that you can do if you've experienced more stress, more trauma, and more adversity than the average person, is to have this awareness, to have mindfulness. And that's because if this is true for you, your body makes more stress hormones. Your biological systems get more easily overstimulated, and you might be quicker to anger, or it might be more easily for you to react impulsively. You might even get sick more easily and more often. And I'm speaking from experience. I totally relate to this. I fall into this category. And so I just wanted to share this in case it helps you have more self-compassion and to forgive yourself and just to understand exactly what's going on. And if you feel like, you're crazy or just different from others, there are real reasons why, if this is true for you, if you have a history of trauma. And so when you have this awareness and this mindfulness to notice what's happening internally, you can recognize when you're having a stress response, and then you can make the adjustment that you need, whatever that is. And it might be that you need to step up your workout or adjust your sleep or back off on the alcohol or connect with a friend or talk to your therapist. So just sharing that because there is hope and you can heal. These essential self-care practices are really, really supportive for this, especially this one, the mindfulness and mindfulness meditation practices. And so for this one, for the actual mindfulness practices, this is the best way to develop that awareness, is to actually practice techniques that develop that awareness, the mindfulness. And so there's 2 main ways to do that. The first one is with what we call informal or everyday mindfulness practices, things that you can do when they fit into your day, when they fit into your schedule. Some examples are giving loved ones undivided attention for several minutes, doing some yoga or some Tai Chi, practicing some belly breathing, or something called 4-7-8 breathing, going for a mindful walk and engaging the senses. Or it could even be mindful eating, where you really engage the senses and focus on the senses. Then there's more formal practices that are even more supportive. These are going to be your formal meditation practices. These are things that you plan into your day and you practice regularly and you practice daily. You sit down to do the practice. The best way to get started with this is to take a 6 to 8 week course. Really teaches you in a systematic way how to practice and how to get through challenges, because challenges come up. People give up. There's some real challenges that come up, but there's solutions to all of these challenges, and you learn that in a course. And you learn the breathing and awareness practices and mindful movement and these kinds of things. And then lastly on this topic is the extra benefit, just to mention it again, that when you practice mindfulness meditation, it raises your level of consciousness. And in order to make a change, in order to implement any of these self-care practices, first you need to be totally 100% conscious of your thoughts and feelings and actions in that area. And that's what mindfulness and meditation practices help you do. Okay, and then lastly, before we wrap up, let's talk about dealing with the stress versus dealing with the stressor. So the things we've talked about today are to help you deal with the stress so that then you can better deal with the actual stressors. So we talked about step 1, completing your stress response cycle daily, and step 2, implementing these essential self-care practices. So what these do is they get you into a much better place for now beginning to deal with the stressors, because you can now think more clearly and be feeling much, much better. And so it'll be much easier to identify the root causes and deal with them. And those are going to be things that are both outside of your control and within your control. Things that are external and also things that are internal. So external things like workplace structures, demands of caretaking that might include unreasonable workloads, lack of support, lack of resources. And it could be internal things. It could be a mixture of all of these, but it could be internal things like lack of boundaries, communication skills that need improvement, not having the ability to advocate for yourself, not having a sense of autonomy. So these kinds of things. So just to acknowledge the difference between dealing with the stress versus dealing with the stressor. All right, so your next steps. So if you haven't already done it, take a moment to rank these, to put these in priority order, these essential self-care practices, which one needs your attention most, which one is second, and so on. You don't need to start with all of them, or even with a few of them. That's a recipe for disaster. Start where you are, just one step at a time, step by step, set yourself up for success. Journal about it if that's part of your practice. It'll support you. And then to support you further, if a handout would be helpful to you, I created that free downloadable PDF that has a checklist of all of these, plus journal prompts to help support you in gaining momentum and deciding exactly what the most smallest next step is that you can take. So there's a link to that in the show notes, and you can find it at melissamwheeler.com/essential. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I hope it was helpful for you. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a future episode, and leave a review where you're listening to this. It helps us reach more listeners who need this information. And remember to get your copy of my free PDF download, The Essential Self-Care Practices, with the checklist and the journal prompts. I want to also invite you to join my private Facebook group where I share tips like these and lead a live weekly mindfulness meditation practice. So if you're wanting just some kind of quick, easy, regular check-in to support you with mindfulness, or if you're wanting to dip your toe into meditation and just check it out, that would be a great option to get started. Also want you to know that I have consultations and introductory coaching sessions available. I have some free options as well. So if you're interested in working one-on-one with me, I would love to work with you, and I'll leave a link for that in the show notes. And then I want to invite you to subscribe to my newsletter, where I share about new episodes and share more helpful tips and resources and offerings that I have coming up. I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. And then lastly, follow me on Instagram. I'm at Melissa M. Wheeler MMW for behind the scenes content and updates. I'd love to hear from you over there too. Leave a comment or send me a direct message. And make sure to check out the next episode of the Busy Mind podcast, all about how the trauma, the stress, and the adversity you've experienced has made you more susceptible to chronic stress and burnout and what to do about it. I can't wait to connect with you again next time.